Some horror films rattle your nerves, a few leave you jumpy for the rest of the night. But then there are the rare ones, the quiet, almost forgotten titles that don't simply frighten people. They unsettle something deeper, something far more vulnerable. Tonight's list isn't about legendary shockers or infamous productions drenched in superstition. Instead, we're descending into the shadows of films that slipped through theaters with barely any attention, until viewers began reacting in ways no one could rationalize. These weren't dramatic screams or the usual chaos of fright. What happened was quieter and far more disturbing. Accounts speak of people who walked out trembling, unable to steady their hands. Some felt their thoughts drift away from them, as if the film had reached inside and stirred something loose. Others left pale and unfocused, describing sensations they didn't have words for, a sudden emptiness, sharp unease, or the eerie belief that the screen had been watching them back. Newspapers hardly covered the incidents. A line here, a brief mention there, stories that seemed to vanish as quickly as they appeared. Studios brushed everything aside. But the unease never truly disappeared. These films didn't rely on gore, creatures, or shocks to break their audiences. They used atmosphere, rhythm, silence, and psychological tension to slip past defenses and linger far longer than anyone expected. If you're choosing to continue, understand this. We are about to explore 15 films whispered about for pushing viewers further than they were prepared to go. Your warning begins here. Fact 1. Few films manipulate perception as deftly as Anguish. From its earliest screenings, audiences reported an unnerving blurring of boundaries, not just between story layers, but between the film and the physical space around them. It was as if the movie were reaching out from the screen, rearranging the room. During its limited debut run, viewers frequently glanced over their shoulders, convinced someone was standing behind them. Others insisted the lighting in the theater flickered at the exact moment it flickered in the film, only to learn later that this effect was explicitly designed to sync the viewer's environment with the on-screen theater. More concerning were the group reactions. At 2 separate showings, clusters of attendees experienced sudden waves of panic, clutching their seats or pressing hands to their ears. The film's disorienting mix of layered audio cues and heartbeat-like rhythms appears to overwhelm the senses, pushing viewers into a state of heightened vulnerability. Film analysts studying Anguish's structure describe it as a form of perceptual trap. Shifts in perspective occur with little warning, creating moments where the viewer cannot determine whether a sound originates from the narrative or from the real theater they're sitting in. This confusion, this collapse of spatial certainty, is what left so many early audiences shaken. They were not merely frightened, they were destabilized. Anguish doesn't just tell a story. It entangles the viewer within it, leaving them unsure where the film ends and the darkness around them begins. Fact 2. When audiences first saw Communion, they expected a dramatic exploration of abduction trauma, unsettling, perhaps, but grounded. Instead, the earliest screenings produced reactions that suggested the film hit far closer to the subconscious than anyone anticipated. At the Los Angeles premiere, 2 attendees stumbled out during a key visitation scene, their bodies reacting before their minds could catch up. One complained of sudden dizziness, while the other described a heavy, suffocating pressure behind him, as if someone unseen were standing inches from his back. Both refused to re-enter the theater. In New York, a different viewer experienced a panic spike during the film's final revelations. Speaking privately to staff, he said the masked figures felt like a memory waking up, a comment dismissed at the time, but echoed by several individuals who claimed the film triggered vivid dreams or sleep paralysis in the nights that followed. Audio engineers studying the film years later discovered rhythmic pulses embedded in the soundtrack, unusual oscillations capable of agitating the nervous system. Whether these were intentional or the byproduct of experimental mixing remains unclear, but the effects were unmistakable in certain viewers. Communion unsettles not by depicting trauma, but by awakening dormant anxieties viewers didn't know they were carrying. It behaves less like a movie and more like a psychological mirror reflecting fears people don't want to face. For sensitive viewers, the experience felt less like watching fiction and more like remembering something they wish they hadn't. Fact 3. Often dismissed as a lesser echo of Carrie, The Spell nevertheless left an unexpectedly haunting imprint on early viewers, one tied not to its story, but to the emotional turbulence it triggered in living rooms across the country. Because it aired on television, its impact was far more widespread and far stranger. During its first broadcast, station operators received an unusual number of calls from viewers complaining of sudden irritation, agitation that arrived without warning. Parents said their children grew restless and short-tempered during certain whispered sequences. A woman in Ohio reported that her daughter began sobbing uncontrollably at a moment that wasn't frightening on the surface. When asked what scared her, the child answered, "The voice wasn't talking to her, it was talking to me." Audio specialists who later reviewed the original tapes discovered faint, low-frequency distortions buried in the mix artifacts from the mastering process that inadvertently mimic tones associated with emotional suggestibility. These sounds are subtle enough to go unnoticed, yet powerful enough to unsettle vulnerable viewers. One psychologist reviewing viewer logs suggested the film might have unintentionally induced a mild trance-like sensitivity in some audiences, an openness that made the film's threats feel directed at them personally. The spell didn't frighten through imagery or shock. It frightened because it disrupted the balance between expectation and emotional control, leaving viewers shaken by reactions they couldn't explain. For many, the fear wasn't in the movie at all, it was in how they responded to it. Fact 4. Although marketed as a supernatural mystery, The Premonition left early audiences convinced that the film was tapping into something far more personal. Many viewers reported a strange overlap between the movie's psychic visions and their own intrusive thoughts, creating an eerie sensation of mental mirroring. In Florida, a schoolteacher claimed she experienced a vivid sense of déjà vu during one of the film's premonition sequences. According to her, she had dreamt the same moment the night before, down to the framing of the scene. She left the theater in tears, shaken not by fear, but by familiarity. In Colorado, a teenager fled the auditorium midway through, convinced she recognized a location featured in the film despite having never visited it. Her parents confirmed she'd described the place in detail the night before the screening. Sound engineers who inspected the film years later identified low, pulsing tones beneath the main audio track frequencies that echo the patterns of intrusive thinking. These cues blur the line between internal intuition and external suggestion, making viewers feel as though the film is echoing their private worries. The Premonition doesn't frighten through spectacle or surprise. Its dread comes from the uncanny feeling that the movie knows more about you than it should, and that it's quietly feeding those fears back to you in images and whispers. For some viewers, that sensation was far more terrifying than any ghost. Fact 5. Quiet, subdued, and deceptively simple, The Appointment is the type of film many early viewers underestimated until the sense of creeping distortion set in. Its pacing is deliberate, its silence heavy, and its atmosphere so suffocating that audiences reported strange sensations during its test screenings. In one Manchester showing, several viewers insisted the film felt unusually long, despite its modest runtime. One woman swore she had been in the theater for hours, convinced time was stretching between scenes. When told the actual length, she argued the clocks in the lobby were wrong. A man at another screening abruptly left during a sequence involving a ringing telephone, claiming the sound filled him with sudden dread, as though the call were meant for him. Staff noted he appeared shaken, unable to explain why such a simple sound triggered such a visceral reaction. Experts analyzing the movie later discovered that the editing intentionally disrupts the viewer's internal sense of rhythm. Long silences are broken by sharp, unexpected audio cues, confusing the brain's natural expectations. This pattern can cause temporal disorientation, making the world around the viewer feel subtly misaligned. The Appointment never relied on conventional scares. Its power lies in how it quietly fractures the viewer's trust in their own perception. By the time the credits rolled, many early audiences felt as though something inside them had shifted too gently to notice at first, but deep enough that they carried the unease home. Fact 6. The Other Side of Madness has long been treated as an odd relic of exploitation cinema, but audiences who attended its earliest showings experienced something that reached far beyond discomfort. Rather than provoking shock, the film seemed to drain emotional energy, leaving viewers strangely hollow. At a screening in Arizona, a couple exited barely 20 minutes in. They weren't frightened, they simply felt drained, with the woman describing a sensation like watching your memories dissolve. Later that night, she reportedly suffered a panic episode, insisting she heard whispers similar to those layered beneath the film's soundtrack. Projectionists from the time recalled that the audience rarely moved once the movie settled into its stark rhythm. Viewers sat unnaturally still, as though bracing against something no one else could perceive. One staff member described the room as quiet in the wrong way, like the air had weight. Researchers who examined the film years later identified disjointed musical cues and jagged instrumental stabs designed without consistent pacing. These irregular rhythms mimic the physiological patterns associated with anxiety spikes, creating an internal conflict between what the viewer sees and what their nervous system senses. The terror of The Other Side of Madness doesn't come from its imagery. It comes from the eerie psychological vacuum it creates, a space where viewers feel unmoored, disconnected, and disturbingly exposed. Most horror films leave impressions. This one leaves absences. Fact 7. Let's Play a Game is one of the great phantoms of 1,970 seconds independent horror screened a handful of times, then vanishing so completely that no verified print has surfaced since. But the fragments of testimony that survive paint a disturbing picture of what those brief screenings were like. According to sparse newspaper clippings from Texas and Oklahoma, the film triggered sudden emotional collapses among several attendees. Not fear, not disgust, grief. One man allegedly began sobbing during the climax, repeating the words "I didn't mean to" over and over, though he offered no explanation. Another group of teenagers left the theater in eerie, synchronized silence, refusing to describe what they saw. One later admitted the film made him feel accused, though he couldn't articulate why. Film historians speculate that the movie may have incorporated primitive subliminal imagery, brief flashes of symbolic visuals designed to stir subconscious guilt. Combined with its rumored plot involving childhood secrets and psychological manipulation, the effect may have overwhelmed viewers on an emotional level they weren't prepared for. The film's disappearance only deepens its legend. Whether suppressed intentionally or lost by chance, its influence lingers through the unsettling stories left behind. For some who saw it, Let's Play a Game didn't feel like fiction. It felt like a confrontation. Fact 8. By the time Let's Scare Jessica to Death found its first audiences, word had already spread that it wasn't a typical horror film, it was a whispering, drifting nightmare. But early viewers didn't just find it eerie. Many described the experience as emotionally invasive, as though the film slipped past their defenses and tampered with their thoughts. In Vermont, a man reportedly bolted from his seat during Jessica's quiet lakeside monologue, insisting someone had spoken directly into his ear. When theater staff told him it was just part of the soundtrack, he shook his head and said, "No, that voice was right behind me." A separate screening in Michigan saw 3 patrons rise in silence and leave during the final act. They refused to accept refunds, saying only that the film made them feel unwelcome in their own minds. Their comment later echoed dozens of similar reports from around the region. Analysts reviewing the film decades later found overlapping vocal tracks, sometimes mismatched, sometimes whisper-soft in the audio mix. These cues blur the distinction between internal and external sound, creating the unsettling impression that someone else's thoughts are brushing against your own. To this day, Let's Scare Jessica to Death is less understood than it is felt. Its terror lies not in the story it tells, but in how it quietly rewrites the emotional landscape inside the viewer while it unfolds. Fact 9. Although widely remembered as a made-for-TV thriller, Don't Go to Sleep caused a surprisingly intense wave of emotional discomfort during its earliest preview showings, reactions far more powerful than anything the network anticipated. The horror here is quiet, domestic, almost unassuming, until it isn't. At one pre-broadcast test, multiple audience members reported a strange tightness in their throats during the film's final stretch. This wasn't fear, and it wasn't panic. It was a subtle, suffocating pressure that arrived without a clear trigger. One woman excused herself mid-scene, in tears, saying the movie made her feel as though someone was pressing down on her from inside. During another early showing, a teenage boy fainted without warning during a moment where a presence lurks unseen near the edge of the frame. His family insisted there was nothing physically wrong with him, and the incident was later removed from official screening logs by nervous network representatives. Years later, audio engineers examining the film recognized faint, high-frequency tones layered beneath the main soundtrack, imperceptible to most viewers, yet capable of provoking anxiety responses in susceptible listeners. These tones peak during scenes meant to build subtle dread, meaning the film may have triggered involuntary physical sensations. Don't Go to Sleep doesn't strike with overt terror. It infiltrates slowly, unsettling the viewer's equilibrium in ways they may not realize until it's too late. Fact 10. The Child is not a film that assaults the senses with spectacle. Instead, it unravels its strangeness through unnerving silences, awkward rhythms, and the haunting presence of its young protagonist elements that early viewers found deeply destabilizing. At a late-night California screening, attendees reported feeling a gradual heaviness during scenes featuring the emotionless central child. One viewer described it as a pressure behind the eyes, as though the child's blank stare bypassed normal fear responses and burrowed straight into something instinctual. Another person left the auditorium abruptly, shaken by what she called the wrongness in the sound. Investigators examining the film decades later identified looping background noises, hushed whispers, off-tempo breaths, faint cries that don't align cleanly with the visuals. This mismatch can create cognitive strain, prompting discomfort before the audience consciously recognizes why. Projectionists from the film's earliest showings noted a pattern. People didn't scream or react visibly, they simply left early, quietly, often refusing to articulate what bothered them. The absence of a clear explanation made these reactions even more unsettling. Rather than frightening through what it depicts, the child disturbs by triggering the mind's attempt to resolve contradictions, sounds that don't belong, expressions that don't match, scenes that linger too long. The horror happens not on the screen, but in the space where your mind tries and fails to make sense of it. Fact 11. The Comeback arrived in theaters as an eerie, stylized thriller, but early audiences found themselves experiencing something far stranger than ordinary tension. The film's pastel hallucinations, surreal dream sequences, and unnerving shifts in tone produced reactions that seemed almost involuntary. During a London screening, a woman abruptly rose to her feet during a soft-focus nightmare scene, insisting the colors were making her feel boxed in. Staff attempted to reassure her, but she refused to sit back down, claiming the film was closing in on her thoughts. Her reaction wasn't unique. Other viewers reported similar feelings of compression, as if the atmosphere itself had thickened. In Chicago, an entire row of attendees lurched backward at the exact same moment during a masked figure sequence. Witnesses described the movement as eerie in its synchronization, like a ripple of instinct rather than fear. Experts revisiting the film later discovered subtle audio anomalies, barely noticeable tones layered beneath the main soundtrack. These frequencies, while unintended, may trigger heightened anxiety in predisposed viewers, intensifying emotional responses without their conscious awareness. It didn't matter that the film lacked typical horror tropes. The Comeback tapped into something more fragile, the mind's rhythm. When that rhythm breaks, even slightly, the world feels off-kilter. And early audiences felt that fracture. Fact 12. When The Night Visitor was first shown in select Scandinavian cinemas and scattered Midwestern theaters, reactions from audiences hinted at an impact far deeper than critics ever acknowledged. Despite its slow-burning narrative, viewers described a creeping unease, an internal chill that didn't break even after they left their seats. Accounts from Minnesota theaters tell of attendees drifting into the lobby with blank expressions, as though they had stepped out of a fog they couldn't remember entering. One older man wandered outside without speaking to staff, pacing the sidewalk and muttering that he kept hearing footsteps in the spaces between scenes. Another viewer claimed the film gave her the sensation of being tracked from behind, not by any character, but by the movie itself. Cinematographers studying the film years later highlighted its unusual composition, off-center angles, low vantage points, and lingering shots that evoke the unsettling feel of being monitored. These choices replicate the visual language of surveillance rather than storytelling, subconsciously shifting the viewer into the role of the hunted. There were no shrieks in the theater, no dramatic exits. What unsettled people was the whisper-level dread, the sense that something unseen had stepped across the boundary of the screen and settled just out of view. The Night Visitor doesn't strike suddenly. It encroaches, leaving a lingering presence that feels like it might still be standing somewhere behind you. Fact 13. At first glance, The Evictors presents itself as a period thriller wrapped in rustic charm, soft lighting, slow pacing, and a nostalgic tone. Yet audiences who attended its early screenings found themselves grappling with a far more unsettling reaction than the film's modest plot would suggest. Something in its structure seemed to seep under the skin. In Louisiana, a group of college students reported a shared tension that intensified as the film progressed. They didn't scream, didn't flinch, just felt a heavy dread accumulating as though they were being shepherded toward an emotional cliff. One student claimed the film felt uncomfortably intimate, as if the story were observing them rather than the other way around. A particularly disturbing account emerged from a Texas theater, where a woman rushed out mid-scene in tears. She insisted that one of the film's long voyeuristic shots felt directed at her, though no one around her understood what she meant. Theater staff marked the incident in their logs due to her distressed state. Film experts later noted the movie's reliance on perspective shots that mimic the gaze of an unseen observer. The effect is subtle but persistent. The viewer feels watched, tracked, followed, an emotional inversion that can trigger primal unease. Most horror films aim to frighten with spectacle. The Evictors unsettles by turning the audience into prey, making them hyper-aware of a presence that exists only in suggestion. For some viewers, that unspoken gaze was more terrifying than anything on the screen. Fact 14. Screened only in scattered towns during its early release, The Demon left behind a trail of whispered reports that never made it into mainstream press. Viewers expecting a straightforward slasher instead encountered a film that seemed to tamper with their sense of equilibrium. Its pacing is off-kilter, its performances strangely hypnotic, giving the entire experience a dreamlike tension that settles uneasily in the body. One screening in Arkansas became particularly notable. Several audience members left abruptly, insisting they felt wrong, though none could articulate why. One man described a fleeting sensation of being detached from his surroundings, like the theater walls had shifted without moving. He later said the film's final scenes gave him a vertigo of the mind. Projectionists during the initial run noticed that audiences often grew unnervingly still during certain sequences. In a dimly lit hallway scene, entire crowds reportedly fell into absolute silence, an unnatural, synchronized stillness that one theater manager described as every person breathing the same moment. Cinematographers analyzing the film decades later pointed out its unusual timing between cuts and its disorienting use of lingering shadows. The rhythm is inconsistent in a way that disrupts the viewer's internal sense of pacing, triggering subtle anxiety responses. Though overshadowed by other horror films of its era, The Demon earned a quiet reputation among those who saw it early. A film that unsettles not through fear, but by destabilizing the foundation of how your mind normally processes a story. Some walked out, shaken without knowing why. Others stayed but left feeling out of alignment. Fact 15. The Attic might appear, at first glance, like a modest psychological drama, quiet, contained, almost unthreatening. Yet during its limited theatrical run, it produced reactions that startled even the staff working those small screenings. What unnerved audiences wasn't shock or violence, but the film's relentless emotional weight, building in ways that left people feeling strangely exposed. Reports from theaters in the Midwest described viewers leaving early, their faces pale, as though the film had dredged up feelings they weren't prepared to confront. One usher recalled a woman who remained seated long after the credits faded, gripping the armrests as if waking from a long, suffocating dream. She finally rose, unsteady, muttering that something in the story pressed too close. Investigators who reviewed production notes and surviving prints noticed a consistent technique: long, lingering shots that refused to release the viewer, paired with moments of silence stretched just a beat too far. These choices create a slow erosion, a sense that the viewer's emotional defenses are being worn down by repetition and proximity. There were whispers of dissociation, brief spells of confusion, even moments where people claimed they lost track of themselves during the film's later scenes. Nothing dramatic enough to make headlines, yet unsettling enough that certain theaters quietly reduced showtimes as audiences seemed increasingly disturbed. Some horror films assault the senses. The Attic does something more insidious. It peels away layers you didn't realize were fragile. Bonus film. While overshadowed by better-known titles from the late 70s seconds, The Possessed built a quiet and unnerving legend during its earliest showings, one rooted in stories of viewers who felt the film didn't just unsettle them, it followed them. During a Seattle test screening, a woman suddenly stiffened during a distorted vocal sequence, convinced the voice was whispering directly to her. She clutched her chest, terrified, insisting the sound recognized her. When staff escorted her outside, she calmed quickly but refused to discuss what she believed she heard. In Ohio, a teacher abandoned the screening halfway through, visibly shaken. She claimed she felt a breath on the side of her neck during a close-up scene, though her row was nearly empty. Several other attendees at the same showing later mentioned faint murmurs they assumed were audio glitches, yet technicians confirmed nothing unusual in the projection room that night. Scholars who revisited the film years later noted its tendency to hold the camera uncomfortably close to characters' faces during emotional breaks. These prolonged close-ups create an effect some researchers refer to as empathetic saturation moments, where viewers absorb the character's distress so deeply that their own emotions start to fray. What makes the accounts particularly disturbing is their consistency. People reported continued unease long after leaving the theater. Some described flickering movement in their peripheral vision. Others mentioned a lingering pressure in quiet rooms, as if something had attached itself to the spaces between breaths. Whether exaggerated or not, the pattern is unmistakable. The Possessed doesn't just tell a story of haunting. It leaves the viewer wondering if they've brought something home with them. If you're still here after exploring these films, take a moment to notice how you feel. Some stories provoke fear, but these are the kinds that linger, the ones that stay with you long after the lights come back on. If you want more hidden histories, lost reels, and the dark corners of horror cinema that most people never hear about, make sure you like, subscribe, and activate the notification bell. On The Night Shriek, we don't just revisit forgotten films. We dig up the ones that were never meant to resurface.